5 bikers closed in on a royal guard, mocking him, shoving him, even reaching for his bayonet. They were convinced he was powerless to respond, bound by duty to remain still, but within a minute, all 5 were down. Curious how it happened? Be sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into the story. London's Horse Guards parade stretched before the morning sun like a living postcard, its ancient cobblestones still glistening with dew. Tourists meandered through the courtyard, cameras clicking, children pointing excitedly at the mounted sentries. But there was one figure that commanded attention without seeking it: Lance Corporal Owen Reed, standing motionless at his post, his scarlet tunic pristine against the weathered stone archway behind him. To the casual observer, he appeared almost mythical. The towering bearskin hat cast deep shadows across his weathered face, and his eyes, those steel-grey eyes, remained fixed on some distant point beyond the gathering crowd. His gloved hands rested precisely on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, every line of his posture speaking of centuries-old tradition and unwavering discipline. But beneath that immaculate uniform, beneath the pageantry and ceremony, lived something far more dangerous than any tourist could imagine. Owen Reed wasn't just a guard, he was a weapon, forged in the crucible of modern warfare and tempered by years of service in Afghanistan's most hostile territories. The ceremonial role was just his latest assignment, not his limitation. The morning had started like countless others. Tourists posed for photographs, keeping the respectful distance that centuries of British protocol demanded. Children whispered questions to their parents about the funny hat and why the guard never moved. Street performers set up their acts at safe distances, knowing better than to encroach on the sacred space around the sentry box. Then came the sound that would shatter the morning's tranquility, the deep, throaty roar of motorcycle engines echoing off the ancient walls. 5 Harley-Davidsons rounded the corner in formation, their chrome gleaming, leather-clad riders hunched over their handlebars like modern Vikings seeking conquest. The lead bike, a massive black and chrome beast, belonged to a man the others called Jocks, a nickname earned through too many bar fights and a tendency to leave his mark on whatever crossed his path. Jocks was the kind of man who viewed the world as his personal playground, rules as mere suggestions, and authority as something to be challenged rather than respected. His crew followed his lead without question. Dice, so named for the cubic zirconia studs covering his leather jacket. Tank, whose massive frame made his bike look like a toy. Spider, thin and wiry with intricate tattoos covering every visible inch of skin. And Rookie, the newest member still trying to prove himself worthy of the Brotherhood. They had been riding through London's streets all morning, their presence announced by the thunderous symphony of their engines. What started as a casual ride had evolved into something more aggressive as they encountered the city's morning traffic, its rules, its order. They were Americans on vacation, but more than that, they were men who had never learned to accept boundaries, especially ones they perceived as artificial or ceremonial. The bikes pulled up in a semicircle around Owen's post, engines revving unnecessarily, chrome pipes spitting blue flames. The sudden noise caused nearby tourists to step back, parents instinctively pulling their children closer. But Owen Reed didn't flinch, he didn't blink, he didn't acknowledge their presence in any way that a casual observer might notice. But behind those seemingly vacant eyes, a different kind of calculation was taking place. Years of military training had taught him to assess threats automatically, unconsciously. 5 potential hostiles, positioned strategically to limit escape routes. No visible weapons, but the aggressive posture and obvious disregard for protocol marked them as high-probability troublemakers. His breathing remained steady, but every muscle fiber in his body had shifted into a state of readiness that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been trained to recognize it. Jocks dismounted, first, his heavy boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate force. He was a big man, solidly built from years of manual labor before he'd discovered that intimidation could be just as profitable as honest work. His leather jacket bore the patches of a dozen motorcycle clubs, and his arms were decorated with tattoos that told the story of a life lived on the margins of society. The crowd began to take notice as Jocks swaggered toward Owen's position. Some tourists raised their cameras, sensing that something entertaining might be about to unfold. Others, perhaps more sensitive to the subtle shift in atmosphere, began to edge away, A few local Londoners in the crowd exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this type of confrontation before, though rarely with such obvious potential for escalation. Jock stopped just inches from Owen's position, close enough that the guard could smell the whiskey on his breath, the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his leather, the particular musk of a man who viewed personal hygiene as optional. The biker's eyes were bloodshot, whether from alcohol, lack of sleep, or both, and there was a manic energy about him that suggested someone looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Well, Jock drawled, his American accent thick with mockery. What do we have here? The famous British Royal Guard, standing like a statue. Tell me something, fancy boy, you actually real under all that get-up, or are you just some kind of wax dummy they wheel out for the tourists? Owen's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, but every word was being processed, catalogued, filed away as additional intelligence about the threat developing in front of him. The verbal provocation was textbook, an attempt to elicit a response that would justify escalation. In Afghanistan, the Taliban had used similar tactics before ambushes. The psychology was identical, even if the context was vastly different. Dice had joined his leader, circling to Owen's left side with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to pack hunting. His fingers drummed against his thigh in a nervous rhythm, and his eyes darted constantly between Owen and the growing crowd of onlookers. Unlike Jock's, who seemed driven by pure bravado, Dice had the calculating look of someone who enjoyed the technical aspects of intimidation. Maybe he can't hear us through that ridiculous fur hat, Dice suggested, reaching out as if to test the texture of Owen's bearskin. The movement was deliberate, designed to invade personal space and provoke a reaction. It was also a mistake that revealed just how little these men understood about what they were dealing with. Tank had positioned himself behind Owen, his massive frame blocking any potential retreat. Spider and Rookie flanked the right side, completing the encirclement. From their perspective, they had successfully cornered their prey. From Owen's perspective, they had helpfully arranged themselves in an optimal pattern for sequential neutralization. The verbal taunting continued, growing more aggressive as Owen failed to respond. Jock's voice rose, his gestures becoming more theatrical as he played to the crowd that was now openly filming the confrontation. You know what I think, Jock announced, spinning in a slow circle with his arms spread wide. I think this whole thing is a joke. A big, expensive joke that the British government plays on tourists. Dress up some actor in a funny costume, tell him to stand really still, and watch the money roll in from all the suckers who think they're seeing something special. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but the tension was palpable. Even the least perceptive observers could sense that something was building toward a breaking point. Several tourists had already begun backing away, their survival instincts overriding their curiosity. Dice had grown bolder, his hand now hovering mere inches from Owen's ceremonial sword. The weapon was an integral part of the uniform, a symbol of the Guard's authority and the Crown's power that stretched back through centuries of British military tradition. But to Dice, it was just another prop in what he perceived as an elaborate bit of theater. I bet this thing isn't even real, Dice said, his fingers now actually making contact with the sword's ornate hilt. Probably just some cheap replica they bought from a costume shop. That contact, a moment when a potential threat became an actual assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces, was the line that transformed everything. In Owen's mind, a switch flipped. The ceremonial guard disappeared, and what emerged was Lance Corporal Owen Reed, combat veteran, weapons specialist, and highly trained soldier, who had survived 3 tours in one of the world's most dangerous war zones. But even as his body prepared for action, his mind remained calculating, professional. These weren't enemy combatants, armed with AK-47s and explosives. They were civilian troublemakers, who had crossed a legal line but didn't deserve to be killed for their stupidity. The response would need to be measured, precise, devastating enough to end the threat immediately, but controlled enough to avoid permanent damage. The crowd had gone silent, sensing that some invisible threshold had been crossed. Even Jock seemed to recognize that something had changed, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way Owen's breathing had shifted, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. Perhaps it was the almost imperceptible adjustment in his stance that spoke of coiled energy ready to explode into motion. Spider, growing impatient with the lack of response, decided to escalate matters himself. He pulled out his phone and stepped closer, angling for a selfie with the stoic guard as his backdrop. "Hey, Tin Man," he called out, waving the phone. "Smile. For the camera, let's show the folks back home what British hospitality really looks like." The phone's camera flash strobed directly into Owen's is a tactical error that would have been immediately punished on any battlefield. But Owen didn't react to the flash itself. Instead, he processed it as additional evidence of the group's hostile intent and their fundamental misunderstanding of the situation they had created. Rukia, eager to impress his more experienced companions, had been growing increasingly agitated by Owen's lack of response. In his mind, the guard's silence was a sign of weakness, an invitation to push harder. He stepped forward and actually poked Owen in the chest with his index finger. "What's wrong with you, man?" Rookie demanded. "Cat got your tongue. Or maybe you're just too scared to move without permission from Mummy." The physical contact was the final element in Owen's threat assessment equation. What had begun as verbal harassment had progressed through intimidation and was now actual assault. Under British law, under military regulations, and under the basic human right of self-defense, Owen Reed was now authorized to respond with appropriate force. But appropriate force, in the hands of someone with Owen's training and experience, was a precisely calibrated instrument of destruction. The transformation began in his eyes. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, Owen's gaze shifted, moving from its fixed position on the horizon to focus directly on the men surrounding him. But these weren't the vacant, ceremonial eyes that tourists were accustomed to seeing. These were the eyes of a predator that had just identified its prey. Tank, positioned behind Owen, was the first to notice the change. Something in the guard's posture had shifted, becoming more fluid, more dangerous. The big biker had been in enough fights to recognize when an opponent was preparing to engage, and every instinct he possessed was suddenly screaming warnings. "Ah, jocks," Tank said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that his companions had rarely heard from him. "Maybe we should." He never finished the sentence. Owen moved with a speed and precision that defied belief. Years of hand-to-hand combat, training, countless hours of drilling and practice, and the muscle memory developed through actual life-or-death encounters all converged in a single, devastating sequence of motion. His first target was Dice, whose hand was still resting on the ceremonial sword. Owen's left elbow snapped backward and upward, catching the biker squarely in the nose, with a sound like a branch snapping. Cartilage crumpled, blood exploded across Dice's face, and the man's legs immediately buckled as his brain tried to process the sudden, overwhelming pain. But Owen was already moving to his next target. As Dice began his collapse, Owen pivoted on his left foot, his right leg sweeping in a devastating arc that caught Rookie in the solar plexus. The younger man's breath exploded from his lungs, in a sound somewhere between a cough and a scream, and he doubled over, gasping desperately for air that wouldn't come. Spider, his reflexes perhaps sharpened by years of avoiding the consequences of his various illegal activities, managed to take a step backward and raise his hands defensively. It didn't help. Owen's right hand shot forward in a precise strike that caught the thin man directly on the mandibular nerve cluster just below his left ear. Spider's eyes rolled back, and he dropped as if someone had simply switched off his consciousness. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 2 seconds. Jocks, the self-appointed leader of the group, found himself facing a situation that his experience in bar fights and street brawls had never prepared him for. The ceremonial guard had transformed into something that moved like liquid violence, and 3 of his crew were already neutralized. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. "What the hell?" he began. But Owen was already responding to the threat. A straight right hand caught Jocks in the sternum, not hard enough to stop his heart, but with sufficient force to convince his nervous system that breathing was temporarily optional. As the big biker stumbled backward, Owen stepped forward and delivered a controlled uppercut to the underside of Jocks's jaw. Not enough to break bones, but more than enough to scramble his neural pathways and send him crashing to the cobblestones. Tank, the largest and potentially most dangerous of the group, had finally overcome his shock and was charging forward with the desperate fury of a man who suddenly realized he was in a fight for survival. His massive hands reached for Owen's throat, his 280 pounds of muscle and fat moving with surprising speed. Owen sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, grabbed Tank's extended arm, and used the big man's own momentum against him. A textbook hip toss sent Tank sailing through the air before gravity introduced him to the cobblestones with bone-jarring force. The impact drove the air from his lungs and left him staring up at the London sky, wondering how he had suddenly ended up horizontal. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 15 seconds, from first contact to final takedown. 5 men who had approached with the confidence of predators were now scattered across the courtyard like discarded toys, groaning, bleeding, and struggling to understand what had just happened to them. Owen Reed straightened his tunic, adjusted his bearskin hat, and resumed his position. His breathing was perhaps slightly elevated, but to the casual observer, he appeared as composed and unmoved as he had been before the confrontation began. The only evidence of what had just occurred was the 5 leather-clad forms writhing on the ground around his post. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in a mixture of cheers, applause, and excited chatter. Phones emerged from pockets and purses as people scrambled to capture footage of the aftermath, though most had been too shocked to record the actual confrontation. "Bloody hell!" shouted a voice with a thick Yorkshire accent. "Did you see that?" Dropped all 5 of them like they were nothing. An elderly woman with a camera around her neck was shaking her head in amazement. "I've been coming here for 30 years, she told her companion, "and I've never seen anything like that. Magnificent." A group of American tourists was particularly vocal in their appreciation. "That was absolutely incredible," one of them exclaimed. "Those idiots had no idea what they were messing with." The sound of approaching sirens indicated that someone had called the Metropolitan Police, though given the number of witnesses and the obvious nature of the assault, it was more a matter of procedure than necessity. The bikers weren't going anywhere, and their condition made it clear who the aggressor had been in this particular encounter. Owen's hearing, trained through years of military service to filter and prioritize audio input, picked up the whispered conversations rippling through the crowd. Most of the comments were complimentary, expressing admiration for the guard's skill and restraint. But there were also questions, the kind of speculation that inevitably followed any demonstration of professional violence. How did he move that fast? Where did he learn to fight like that? Is that what they teach all the guards? Do you think he's seen actual combat? The questions revealed the fundamental disconnect between public perception and military reality. To most civilians, the Royal Guards were ceremonial figures, living symbols of British tradition, whose primary function was to stand very still and look impressive for tourists. The idea that these men might also be highly trained soldiers, capable of lethal force when circumstances demanded it, seemed to come as a genuine surprise. But Owen Reed's service record would have answered those questions definitively, if anyone had access to it. 3 tours in Afghanistan, including 18 months attached to special operations units, conducting deep reconnaissance missions in Taliban-controlled territory, advanced hand-to-hand combat certification, marksmanship instructor, rating, close protection specialist qualification. The ceremonial duties were just his current assignment, not the sum total of his military identity. The first police officers arrived within minutes, approaching the scene with the professional calm of people accustomed to dealing with London's various forms of chaos. Sergeant Patricia Mills, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, took one look at the scene and immediately understood the basic dynamics of what had occurred. 5 motorcycle-riding troublemakers were scattered around the feet of a Royal Guard who stood in perfect formation, apparently unruffled by whatever had just transpired. Given that the Guard's ceremonial sword remained in its sheath and showed no signs of having been drawn, whatever had happened had been accomplished with bare hands. "Right then," Sergeant Mills announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to restoring order to chaotic situations. "I'm going to need statements from everyone who witnessed what happened here." The response was immediate and unanimous. Dozens of voices began speaking at once, all eager to provide their version of events. The consensus was remarkably consistent. The bikers had surrounded the guard, made threatening gestures, actually put their hands on him, and then found themselves comprehensively defeated by what appeared to be a masterclass in defensive combat. An elderly gentleman with the bearing of a retired military officer stepped forward. "Sergeant, I served 30 years in the army, including time in the Falklands," he said. "What that guard did was textbook defensive action, minimal force, maximum effectiveness, and no excessive violence. Those hooligans got exactly what they deserved." A middle-aged woman with a digital camera nodded vigorously. "I got some of it on video," she said. They were completely out of line, touching his sword, pushing him, being absolutely dreadful. The guard showed remarkable restraint, if you ask me. Sergeant Mills began the process of taking formal statements, but the outcome was never really in doubt. British law was quite clear on the rights of individuals to defend themselves against assault, and the rights of military personnel performing official duties were even more explicitly protected. The bikers had committed multiple offenses, from disturbing the peace to assaulting a member of Her Majesty's forces. Paramedics arrived to assess the injured men, though their wounds were more to their pride than their persons. Dice would need his nose reset, and all of them would be dealing with various bruises and aches for the next several days. But there were no life-threatening injuries. Owen's training had allowed him to neutralize the threats with precisely the amount of force necessary, nothing more. As the bikers were helped to their feet and processed for arrest, their earlier bravado had completely evaporated. Jocks, still groggy from the uppercut that had scrambled his brain, kept looking at Owen with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. "How?" was all he managed to say as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. That Owen, maintaining his ceremonial silence, didn't respond. But Sergeant Mills, overhearing the question, allowed herself a small smile. "That, sir, is what we call a professional soldier," she said. "Perhaps you'll think twice before bothering one again." As the excitement gradually died down and the crowd began to disperse, Owen Reed resumed his duties as if nothing had happened. His posture was perfect, his gaze once again fixed on that distant horizon, his hands resting precisely on his sword hilt. To a new arrival, he would appear exactly as he had hours earlier, silent, motionless symbol of British military tradition. But word of the incident was already spreading beyond the immediate area. Social media posts began appearing within minutes, accompanied by shaky phone footage and excited commentary. #RoyalGuard takedown began trending on Twitter. YouTube videos with titles like "British Guard destroys 5 bikers in seconds" started accumulating views. The story would make the evening news, both in Britain and internationally. Military experts would be brought in to explain the training that Royal Guards receive. Tourism officials would note that respect for the Guards was not just traditional courtesy but practical wisdom. The incident would become another chapter in the ongoing legend of the Queen's Guard, a reminder that behind the ceremony lived real soldiers with real skills. For Owen Reed, it was simply another day at work. The confrontation had lasted less than a minute. The paperwork would take longer than the actual incident, and by tomorrow he would be back at his post, ready to deal with whatever challenges the day might bring. But for 5 American bikers, the lesson would last considerably longer. They had learned, in the most direct way possible, that some traditions exist not just for show, but because they represent something deeper, more dangerous, and far more real than ceremonial uniforms might suggest. The Royal Guards of Britain are indeed living symbols of their nation's history and values, but they are also professional soldiers, trained in the arts of war and prepared to defend their posts, their honor, and their country with whatever force the situation demands. As the sun moved higher over London and Horse Guards Parade returned to its normal rhythm of tourists and ceremony, one truth had been made abundantly clear: underestimating a Queen's Guard is a mistake you only make once. Hours later, as Owen's shift neared its end, he would reflect on the morning's events with the analytical mind of a professional soldier. The threat had been assessed correctly, the response had been proportionate and effective, and no innocent bystanders had been harmed. The mission parameters had been met with precision and efficiency, but more than that, a message had been sent that would ripple far beyond the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade. The Royal Guards were not museum pieces or tourist attractions. They were guardians, warriors, and protectors of a tradition that had endured for centuries precisely because it was defended by men and women who understood that some things were worth fighting for. The 5 bikers would heal from their physical injuries, serve their time for the assault charges, and eventually return to their lives. But they would carry with them a permanent reminder that respect is not always optional, that tradition has teeth, and that the seemingly motionless figure in the red tunic and bearskin hat is anything but helpless. And Owen Reed, he would continue his watch, as countless guards had done before him and would do after him, standing ready to remind the world that behind every symbol of peace lives the eternal warrior, patient, disciplined, and utterly uncompromising when the moment for action arrives.